Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Appetite Symposium. My name is Helen Roach, and I work at University College Dublin. And I'll chair this final session, which will present the main findings of our randomised dietary control, our diet and also physical activity randomised controlled trial. And first up, my colleague, Professor Clare Corish, who is a dietitian and professor of clinical nutrition, will present the study design and the experiential element of the randomised controlled trial. Clare.
Thank you very much, Helen, and I'm delighted to present this today. So really what I'm going to, the work package 4, as Dorothy said, involved the human multi-center randomized control trial, and this is really the study design of that. We all know that aging is associated with a reduction in appetite and energy intake. And this nice systematic review and meta-analysis that was carried out in 2016 included 59 studies, which showed that hunger was reduced by 25 to 39%, depending on whether it was fasting or postprandial, that energy intake was reduced by 16 to 20% in older adults. And we know that both of these factors can increase the risk of undernutrition in our older adults. We also know that adequate protein and fibre are important for healthy aging, and several studies have shown that the target intakes are not met, including those, importantly, with a poor appetite. And we know that all of these studies have called for interventions to address reduced appetite or to increase dietary intake, even in people who have a reduced appetite, and that this is really an important public health requirement to reduce nutrient deficiencies and risk of undernutrition. For many, many years, it was thought that protein and indeed dietary fibre have a satiating effect in older adults, as they have in many studies in younger adults. But a very nice systematic review and meta-analysis that was carried out by my colleague Katy Horner with her student Sana a couple of years ago, in which Helen and I were very happy to be involved, looked at the impact of dietary supplementation on appetite and energy intake in healthy older adults. So there were 22 studies in this systematic review and meta-analysis, and of these 13 were longitudinal, so they were not just all acute feeding studies. And these longitudinal interventions showed that you could successfully increase protein intake versus control in those getting the intervention versus control, with no effect on energy intake. It must be noted, however, that in these studies, appetite and energy intake were not the primary outcomes, and none of these studies included plant protein sources, or none of the studies included effects of combining protein with other key nutrients such as fibre. We also know that around the same time, because again, as we have known or have believed for many, many years, is that fibre has a satiating effect, which is absolutely has been shown in younger people. But in older people, this nice study, which was published in 2020, showed that fibre did not suppress appetite, and that actually a pea-hull fibre may be appropriate to increase fibre intake, dietary fibre intake in older adults at nutritional risk. We also know there's an enormous role for physical activity, and the proposed relationship between physical activity and energy intake in older adults has to be included in any nutrition interventions. The appetite suppression at lower physical activity in older adults may be associated with reductions in lean mass and reductions in resting metabolic rate, or reductions in orexigenic signaling, increased satiety signaling, reduced hedonic input, and reduced functional and cognitive capacity. And all of these still require quite a lot of investigation. So, as I said, every nutrition intervention with older adults, there is enough evidence now to indicate that physical activity should form a key strategy in addressing appetite decline. And there is very little evidence base for this in older adults. So our randomized control trial was made up of 6 related work packages, as Dorothy has already explained to you. The the work package 4, which was the one that was carried out in, I suppose, led by UCD, but also there were centres in Nuremberg in Germany and Padua in Italy, had 3 different phases. And the first phase was looking at the sensory and acceptability testing of the plant protein fibre products. So we had 6 plant protein fibre products, as Stephanie outlined, and it was looking at the sensory acceptability testing of those, which my colleague Anna Quinn is going to present to you a little bit on this in the next presentation. Dominique has already presented to you on the amino acid availability and the effect on acute appetite, which informed really, I suppose, the background to the human 12-week RCT. So the information that we gained from work package 1 and from the work in work package 3 actually informed our approach very nicely to the implementation of the RCT. So the aim of the RCT was then to determine the impact of personalized dietary advice, because it was, as Laurel has highlighted, you know, it had to be personalized, incorporating plant protein fiber products, a physical activity program, and their combination in a 2x2 design on appetite and other nutritional, functional, and clinical outcomes in community dwelling older adults. There were 4 groups: personalized diet group, a physical activity group, a combined personalized diet and physical activity group, and a control group who was normal standard of care. And the protocol was written up very nicely by my colleague Katy Horner, and is published in the British Journal of Nutrition last year. And you can see here, as Giuseppe, I think, as everybody has alluded to, Giuseppe, Dominique, and Laurel has alluded to, there were a lot of people involved with the preparation for the study, the work package 4 study. So the randomized control trial incorporated 2 elements. The first was a personalized diet. So in summary, the older people were requested or advised to take 2 by 25 grams of plant protein fiber blend per day. And they were given individualized counseling by a dietitian. I'll come back and give you a little bit more detail on that in a minute. And the physical activity intervention was supervised group exercise twice per week and home-based walking 3 times per week. And again, we'll come back to that in a minute. So the plant protein products, as Stephanie and Dominique already said, were brought down to 2 different products, so protein source A and protein source B. So you can see here, protein source A, PPF-A, contained pea, oat, and almond protein, and PPF-B contained rice, pea, and soy protein. Both contained pea fiber. The products themselves contain between 15 and 17 grams of protein, depending on whether it was A or B, and 3.6 grams of dietary fiber each. And each participant was requested to take 1 of each sachet incorporated into the diet on a daily basis. Because of the information derived from work package 3, we really, and I suppose it answers again maybe the comment that Anna Marie Beck made, is the participants were very much encouraged to use it within meals and our snacks that contain at least 6 to 7 grams of protein from other sources. And the nutritional counselling very much was based on the nutrition care process. It was undertaken by a registered dietitian or trained nutritionist, and it really carefully advised people how to incorporate the PPF. The participants were also advised to have a daily protein intake. So this was calculated out for each person based on the 3-day records that were taken at the beginning of the baseline, and they were advised to take 1 to 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram body weight from food and PPF. And in order that the protein was not used for energy, they were also advised to meet daily energy requirements of between 25 and 30 kilocalories per kilogram body weight per day. The Physical activity intervention, you can see here, it was very much based on previous studies, and really we must acknowledge Professor Ellen Freeberger, who worked on the SPRINT trial, because she provided a lot of input into the group intervention sessions. So the participants had those twice per week. They were all supervised. And then they're also encouraged to do home-based walking, increasing from 20 minutes 3 times a week up to 40 minutes 3 times a week. You can see some examples of the types of activities they did in the group sessions, and all participants were rated their effort using the Borg rating scale. The recruitment for these participants included multiple strategies. We initially wanted to recruit 180, as I said, from the 3 countries. Inclusion criteria were community dwelling, 65 plus, a BMI between 20 and 30 kg per meter squared, and those who were inactive. So it took less than 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous activity per week. We originally had poor appetite in as a criterion, but given the work that Laurel did in Newcastle and her colleagues in Newcastle, we actually removed that, because it became very apparent that older adults could not recognize when they had poor appetite. Exclusion criteria included a medical condition or medication associated with poor appetite. This provides a schematic of the overall intervention. So the older participants were screened by telephone, and they had 4 visits to each of the universities. Test day 1, they had all of their pre-assessment characteristics measured, and test day 2 was the postprandial test day. And at home, they undertook 7-day accelerometry and recorded a 3-day food diary. Then they went on to undertake the 12-week intervention, into which they were broken up divided into the 4 groups, as we said: personalized diet plus physical activity, personalized diet alone, physical activity alone, or the control group. And the physical activity group here, as you can see, had exercise twice per week. This was the supervised exercise classes, so it did include, I suppose, I bring in a social aspect. And the personalized diet group had a phone call at weeks 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, and 11, really to ascertain that they were doing okay, answer any questions, encourage them, etc. And had a 24-hour recall by phone at week 4 and week 8, again to elicit for any issues or try and problem solve. At the end of the 12 weeks, the older participants, again recorded a 7-day on accelerometry and the 3-day food diary, and returned for a test day to look at their post-intervention characteristics. And test day 4 then was the appetite testing day again. So the appetite how appetite was measured was using the SNAC score. We had that at the beginning and we had that at the end. We also used visual analog scale subjective ratings of appetite, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a minute. And they also, we recorded how much they ate from an ad libitum test meal. The dietary intake was recorded using the 3-day food diaries, the physical activity, as we said, ActivePal and PACE. Height and weight was measured on all participants. Body composition was measured using bioimpedance analysis at all 3 centres, using DEXA in Padua and using the BODPOD in UCD. And in UCD, we were also able to measure resting metabolic rate. Cognitive status, depressive symptoms and quality of life, physical function and performance were all measured. You can see here the measures: hand grip strength, knee extension, short physical performance battery and 400-meter walk test. And then biosamples of blood, feces were undertaken, and muscle biopsies, as Giuseppe has already outlined in the University of Padua. So to look at our primary outcomes, the participants came in on the postprandial test day. They had a standardized test meal, which was selected across the 3 centres. So it was pasta and tomato, and that was considered acceptable for older adults in all countries. They came in to each of the universities and had a fixed breakfast, were measured at, underwent appetite measures at baseline, and then had a fixed breakfast, and then the fasts to measure their appetite, which includes hunger, fullness, and desire to eat, as you can see here, was measured after the breakfast, was measured at 0, 30, 60, 120, and 180 minutes, and then following the ad libitum lunch. The primary outcome was postprandial composite score, which my colleague Katy Horner will present now in a few minutes. And the energy intake was the energy intake from the ad libitum lunch meal, which again, Katy will present to you the information on that. And then gut peptides were measured at baseline 30, 60, 120, and 180 minutes, only in the UCD cohort. The secondary outcomes I've sort of mentioned already, but you can see them all here you can see them all here just to remind you. So a lot of these participants underwent a lot of assessment. As Giuseppe said, we have a lot of measures. So the height and weight, the body composition, the appetite, resting metabolic rate, and the physical performance measures, as well as the muscle biopsies in Padua, and motor unit signaling also was taken in Padua. Importantly, however, that I didn't mention already, was the rating of the interventions, because we can have interventions for older people as much as we like, but they have to be acceptable to those older people. And this was very clear again from the work that Laurel had done, and Anna Quinn will now present some of the acceptability of the intervention, the information on the acceptability of the interventions immediately after once I finish. Again, based on the information from work package 1, that if we were to introduce a product that was a novel product, participants needed very concrete, information, practical advice on how to incorporate those into their diets. So because of that, ahead of actually starting the work package 4, and this was a huge amount of work, to be honest, for the researchers involved, a recipe booklet was developed, which had an introduction. It had information on the dosage, how to use the powder, nice tips and tricks. And all of these recipes, so recipes for breakfast, lunch, dinner, desserts, for shakes, were all developed incorporating the plant protein powders, tested, tried, eaten, amended. So you can imagine the amount of work and preparation work that was required for that. And just finally, to show you some of the pictures of some of the recipes that came up, that were developed, I should say. There's some nice breakfast recipes there, pancakes, omelets, how it could be incorporated into porridge, how it could be incorporated into, say, a tuna bake, into hummus, into several desserts, into soups. And again, I mean, Anna will explain to you, but some of the participants actually came up with their own recipes as well, which was really useful and was shared with the participants. So with that, I would just like to thank you all and just say that my colleagues Anna Quinn will present on the acceptance of the intervention, and that then Katy will present the key outcomes. And thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you very much, Claire. We might, there are no questions in the Q&A box for the moment, and I'm sure in terms of continuity, we might fast forward into Anna's presentation in relation to the acceptability and the rollout of the intervention. Now I'd like to introduce Anna Quinn. Anna is a PhD candidate who completed her PhD within this programme. She trained initially in human nutrition, and I'm very much looking forward to Anna's presentation, which is entitled The Acceptance of the Plant Protein and Fibre Products, which were made for us by the Fraunhofer Institute, and also the impact of the physical activity intervention. Anna, thanks very much.
Thank you, Helen. Hopefully you can all see my screen and hear me okay. If you can't, just let me know.
All good.
Brilliant, thank you. So thank you, Helen, for the introduction. Today I'm going to be speaking on the acceptance of plant protein fibre products and a physical activity intervention in older adults. So I'll begin with current evidence in the area before going into the acute study that was mentioned, where we'll look at sensory testing and the acceptability of these plant protein and fibre products. And then I'll move on to the randomised control trial, where we'll look at 12 weeks of a plant protein and fibre supplement with or without a physical activity programme, and we'll look at that in regards to compliance and adverse or side effects. So as an introduction to this topic, we know that protein energy malnutrition is a growing concern in aging populations, and dietary protein plays a key role in the prevention of protein energy malnutrition and also in the environmental impact of the human diet. And this study here is a consumer survey of 1,825 community dwelling older adults aged greater than 65 years across 5 European countries. And they investigated the readiness of older adults to accept the consumption of alternative and more sustainable protein sources. So as you can see here, dairy-based protein was generally the most accepted protein source in food products, with plant-based protein being the most accepted alternative and more sustainable protein source, followed by single-cell, insect, and in vitro protein sources. However, it's also important to consider the facilitators and barriers to plant-based protein consumption, particularly in older adults. And this is a qualitative study aiming to identify older adults' beliefs surrounding the consumption of plant-based proteins. It was conducted in Canada with both plant-based protein consumers and non-consumers via the use of online questionnaires and semi-structured interviews. And these older adults mentioned some advantages being health benefits, taste, environment, with disadvantages including difficulty in digestion and not liking the taste. Facilitators then include greater knowledge surrounding plant proteins, with barriers including a lack of motivation and a lack of knowledge on how to prepare meals, including these plant-based proteins. And this really highlights that future interventions should focus on the beliefs that were identified as important to older adults, so including those health benefits and perhaps skills surrounding the preparation of foods, including plant-based proteins, and also that these interventions should be tailored. It's also important to consider the sensory acceptability, which we spoke about a good bit today, and the liking of these plant protein products. And consumers have long been encouraged to reduce their meat consumption for both health and environmental reasons. And as we've shown, a possible way to do this is to substitute meat with plant protein alternatives. However, the acceptance of these products is often challenging, and we know that the sensory attributes may impact on their palatability. So this study here is based on consumer tests, and this is where recipes were prepared with different plant protein meat substitutes and with meat alone, and they were compared by consumers using a liking scale. You can see an example of that there on the very left-hand corner. And they found that there was lower liking and acceptability of the plant protein meat alternatives when compared to the meat alone, but that plant protein meat substitutes were not all appreciated equally, and that the acceptance depended on the composition and the recipe in which they were included. However, there's still little information on whether or on plant proteins versus animal proteins in regards powders. So for example, a whey powder, particularly when we can incorporate these powders into different food matrices. So for example, soups, drinks, porridges. And again, this is to highlight the importance of the taste and the sensory acceptability of products like this. On the right-hand side here, we see a report from the International Food Information Council survey of 3,000 adults in the US, and consumers consistently report that taste is very impactful on their food and beverage purchase decisions. Taste and health have also been highlighted as two very important considerations for food choice in older adults. And again, a need for food products with improved sensory properties and sensory evaluation of food products for older adults has also been identified. When we look at older adults then with poor appetite, the aim of this study here was to investigate food preferences of older adults with a poor appetite and compare those with food preferences of older adults with a good appetite. So they included older adults in nursing and residential care home settings, in hospitals and in their own home receiving home care. And they used computer-based forced choice food preference assessment. And they found that older adults with poor appetite had a preference for variation, also for colour variation, for non-dairy, high fibre, and solid texture foods. So now this leads us on to the acute study that was undertaken as part of the Appetite Project, which we've alluded to earlier. And the aim of this study was to assess the sensory properties and the acceptance of these plant protein and fibre product mixtures by older consumers in a model food. So we can see here older adults greater than or 65 years of age who were non-smokers were recruited across two of our centres, so FAU in Germany and UCD in Ireland. And in total, 6 varieties of these plant protein and fibre supplements were tested. You can see on the right-hand side there the composition table. 3 of these were savoury and 3 of these were sweet. And we compared these to a control food matrix alone, which was you can see a picture of it there, the Greek-style natural live yogurt. And these were prepared in serving sizes of 15 grams, of which 3 grams contained the PPF or the sample. And again, these products were designed to be incorporated into the usual diet, which is why we tested them in this particular way. So from this, 3 PPF products were selected to progress on to the next stage of the investigation. However, 2 of these were the most liked, and they were PPF 5 and PPF 6, and we can see they're both sweet varieties. And then, as mentioned earlier, again, these were produced into 25-gram sachets for the randomized control trial, which I'll speak about in a moment. Just to show you some further results there from the acute study, the sensory testing and acceptability. Again, PPF 5 and 6 were the most liked. They were both sweet varieties. And you can see there on the right-hand side on the hedonic scale that the PPFs were rated as neither like nor dislike, although they did have a lower liking than the control alone, which was the natural yogurt. So to summarise then the acute study, the PPFs were rated as neither like nor dislike, although they did have a lower liking than the control, which was the natural yogurt. And this is similar to what previous studies have reported, or some have even reported a dislike for oral nutritional supplements in older adults. PPF samples 3, 5 and 6 were selected to progress to the amino acid availability study that was discussed earlier, but PPF 5 and 6 were the most liked varieties and they were both sweet varieties. We did note that different food matrices may improve the acceptability, and we can see from the studies we did that the control yogurt was only rated as slightly or moderately liked. So perhaps by consuming the PPF in a different product, it might be more acceptable to the older adults. And that led to the development of the recipe booklet, which Claire discussed previously. So Claire did bring us through the intervention. I think it's important that we just highlight some of the key points. So I'm just going to go through them briefly. The PPF products were designed to be incorporated into the usual diet and therefore they were recipe based. We asked participants to consume 2 25-gram PPF sachets per day in meals and or drinks. And we also asked them to meet the daily protein intake requirements and daily energy requirements. And this was done on a flexible approach. So our priority really was the PPF consumption of the powders each day and also to achieve those predefined nutritional daily targets. In addition, then, the physical activity intervention included 2 group resistance training sessions per week, following guidelines for older adults, and home-based walking, which progressed to 3 40-minute sessions per week. So to move on to the methods then for the randomized control trial in terms of the compliance and acceptability of the PPF supplementation, we looked at compliance through the use of the completion of the intervention and the reasons the participants gave for dropout. We also looked at compliance logs, so we can see an example of that there in the bottom right-hand corner for the personalised diet group. We also counted the amount of sachets that we gave participants and we asked them to keep the empty sachets, so we counted the return sachets at the end of the intervention. And then finally, we conducted fortnightly compliance telephone calls, which Claire mentioned before, to ensure the participants were consuming the required amount of PPFs and to try to find out if there was any issues and tackle them early. We also collected information on adverse events, primarily through the fortnightly phone calls, but we did include data that was mentioned at any point of the intervention. And then finally, we took ratings of the intervention from post-intervention questionnaires. Similarly, then for the physical activity group, we looked at compliance via the completion of the intervention, reasons for dropout, and also compliance logs. There's an example of that there in the top right-hand corner, slightly different because we have the physical activity sessions included in there. And then we also took attendance at each of these sessions by the instructor, and you can see an example of that there in the bottom right-hand corner. Similar then, we looked at the rating of the interventions from the questionnaires. So Katy will speak on this a little bit later, so I just want to highlight primarily the completion of the trial and the reasons for dropout. We have an average dropout rate of 20% per intervention group, which is fairly typical of lifestyle intervention trials. However, I think it is important to look at the reasons for dropout in each group. And we can see that only 2 participants in each group cited reasons for dropout directly related to the intervention. So it was quite a small amount of people that dropped out because of intervention-related reasons. Moving on then to compliance with the plant protein and fibre products. Again, we asked participants to consume 14 of these sachets per week. That would equate to 2 per day. And we defined compliance as consumption of 10 out of 14 of those sachets per week for 75% of the intervention. So that equates to 9 out of 12 weeks. And you can see a graph of that there on the right-hand side, that there was no dramatic differences between both groups. Mean compliance was also 91% in both the personalised diet and the personalised diet and physical activity group. It's also important to consider the adverse events, which I mentioned, which are primarily based on those phone calls to the participants, but also anything that they self-reported at any point during the intervention. And on these graphs, we see the frequency of those adverse events from week 1 till week 11 of the intervention. And we group these events, which were self-reported, into satiety, gastrointestinal issues, other, or none. And we can see that in the personalised diet group there on the left, we see a greater number of participants reporting satiety and gastrointestinal issues, for example, bloating or constipation, in the earlier weeks of the intervention, but these declined in later weeks. And we see similar findings in the personalised diet and the physical activity group. However, we see less of those gastrointestinal issues. It's also worth noting that the majority of people reported no adverse events on either arm of the intervention, and that other included issues with texture, flavour, issues with perceived weight gain, and potential heartburn as well. So again, on the right-hand side here, these are the percentage of participants reporting greater than or equal to 1 adverse event at each indicated week. And overall, there was no difference in adverse events between groups. We do see a difference in week 1 between groups, but beyond week 1, there's no significant group differences detected. This highlights that physical activity may help to reduce some of the gastrointestinal effects of the plant protein, particularly during the initial weeks of use. And these are just some comments from our participants where they highlighted that they felt the fibre was making a difference regarding their digestion, or that they noticed some differences in gastrointestinal function earlier on in the intervention, and that dissipated as the weeks went on. We also looked at the ease in which participants could integrate the plant protein and fibre and the physical activity intervention into their everyday life via the use of intervention evaluation questionnaires. And we can see an example from the personalised diet group there on the left-hand side. The responses here are to question 1, I was able to integrate the programme into everyday life, and participants gave an answer of agree across all 3 groups. When we move on to question 2 then, similarly, I found it hard to integrate the programme into everyday life. We see participants give an answer of disagree across all 3 groups. For question 3, I enjoyed participating in the programme. We see agree to strongly agree again across all 3 groups. And finally then, question 4, I've experienced physical discomfort during the programme. All groups reported disagree to strongly agree, with the PA group having slightly higher values, and I think that could be expected due to the nature of a physical activity programme. So as Clare mentioned, we also recorded the practical aspects of how participants integrated the plant protein fibres into their diet. And we received these lovely pictures from a participant in Italy who integrated the PPF product into a pasta dish, and she sent us these lovely photos of her making the pasta. So we're really lucky to have this information and this data. However, the consumption of the PPFs did vary between countries. These are some examples of how our participants consumed the plant protein in our German centre. So a lot of participants mix the plant protein into milks, both dairy milks and alternative milks, into other liquid sources. So for example, soups, juices, juices diluted as well was common, into water. And other participants noted that they initially took the PPF with or in food. They didn't like it like that, so then they chose to change it to a liquid format. So for example, in the morning with juice and or sugar. And then again, these are some examples from our Irish centre. Again, quite common to consume the PPF in a liquid format, so in yogurts, in milks, in water, or either straight juices or diluted juices, and also in flavoured yogurts, vegetable soups, and desserts or puddings. So the key messages then for the acceptance of the plant protein fibre products and physical activity interventions in older adults. The 12-week randomised control trial demonstrated similar dropout rates to other lifestyle intervention studies in older adults, and that was approximately 20%. There was very good compliance in those who completed the trial, and these recipes were developed and shared locally. And we think that might be due to the wide range of applications due to the neutral powder form. And again, that implementation was supported by the recipe booklet. The adverse events on satiety and gastrointestinal effects were reported in a subsample, particularly in the first few weeks of the intervention, and longer-term compliance beyond 12 weeks requires further investigation. The practical implications then, a PPF supplementation on physical activity intervention appears to be feasible and acceptable for older adults, and some of those earlier gastrointestinal effects highlight the need for monitoring and the potential beneficial effects of a physical activity during initial supplementation. So thank you very much.
Super, Anna. Thank you so much. And again, given the fact that we're presenting the data in relation to the full dietary intervention study, and also there are no questions as yet, we might revert back with your questions at the end. And next, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Katy Horner. In UCD, and Katy has got a specific interest in appetite measures and ratings. And with that, I'll hand over to Katy, who will present the main outcomes from the dietary and the physical activity intervention trial. Thanks, Katy.
Thank you very much, Helen, for the introduction. So I'm delighted to present the findings from the main work package 4 trial, specifically on the effect of plant protein and fibre supplementation with or without physical activity on appetite and nutritional status. So as Clare highlighted the context of this 12-week RCT, initially we conducted the sensory and acceptability testing on 6 different products. From that, then 3 progressed to an amino acid availability and an acute study investigating appetite. And from that, then we chose the best 2 to progress to the 12-week human RCT. The aim of that 12-week RCT was to determine the impact of personalised dietary advice, incorporating the PPF products, a physical activity programme, and their combination in a 2x2 design on appetite and other nutritional, functional, and clinical outcomes. I'm going to be focusing primarily on the appetite and nutritional outcomes in this presentation, which was the primary outcomes that we assessed. The study design, as Clare highlighted, is published in detail in the protocol paper, which is available open access. We had a recruitment target of 180 older adults across the 3 countries, and the key inclusion criteria Clare's already been through. So community dwelling, over 65, a BMI of 20 to 30. So the focus was on prevention of undernutrition rather than treatment of undernutrition, inactive and without a medical condition associated with poor appetite. The primary outcomes I'll be presenting today, as Clare has introduced, this was the test day design for those. So participants came into the lab in the morning following an overnight fast. They were provided with a fixed breakfast meal, and then 3 hours later, they were provided with an ad libitum lunch meal. We assessed appetite ratings in the fasted state and again at regular intervals up until lunchtime using visual analog scales for hunger, fullness, and desire to eat. Our primary outcome was postprandial net incremental area under the curve for composite appetite score. So that combines hunger, fullness, and desire to eat ratings into one score. Our secondary joint primary outcome was energy intake assessed at the ad libitum lunch test meal. And then, as Claire mentioned, we also assessed appetite-related gut peptides in a subsample. So this was leptin, GLP-1, PYY, and ghrelin, and this was through blood samples taken regularly throughout the test morning. In terms of the secondary outcomes, Claire has been through those. Just to flag, the ones that I'll be presenting on primarily relate to appetite and nutritional status. So our secondary outcomes related to appetite and nutritional status were derived from the 3-day food diary, which was administered at baseline and also in week 12 of the intervention. And habitual appetite we assessed through the simplified nutritional appetite questionnaire assessed at baseline and post-intervention. So it consists of 4 different questions, and this is just an example of one here with the different response categories for that question. In terms of the completion of the trial, we randomized about 44 people to each of the 4 different groups, and you can see that numbers that completed here shown in green. The other thing to note is the PP here, that's the numbers that completed the trial per protocol. So the majority of the participants that did complete the trial met the per protocol criteria that Anna described earlier. The results I'll be presenting on focus on the intention to treat analyses. In terms of baseline characteristics, there were no significant differences between the 4 groups at baseline. So just to give you an idea of the sample included, they were predominantly female, 69% female, a mean age of 72 and BMI of 25. In terms of changes in the key characteristics, so this is weight and body composition shown first. These are changes across the 4 groups from pre to post intervention. So the control group, the personalized diet, physical activity alone, and then combined diet plus physical activity. So overall, we saw a small but significant reduction in body weight of just under 1 kilo with physical activity. However, in the personalized diet groups, weight was maintained. This reduction in weight in the physical activity only group corresponded to a small but significant reduction in fat mass, whereas the change in fat-free mass didn't significantly differ between the 4 groups. We also looked at some of the functional outcomes. So the first one you can see here is the change in 400-meter walk time from pre to post intervention. So all 4 groups got faster. This was to the greatest extent in the combined group, but there was no significant difference between the 4 groups. However, leg strength improved significantly with physical activity, and this was significantly greater than the personalized diet and the control group. Looking at our primary outcomes then, so this figure shows the change in the net incremental area under the curve for appetite. So an increase here indicates an improvement in postprandial appetite. And this is the change for the 4 groups. So the control in blue, the personalized diet in orange, physical activity alone in gray, and then the combined group shown in yellow. When we compared the 4 groups individually, there was no significant differences. But using the 2-by-2 design, we detected a main effect of physical activity, whereby we saw an increase in appetite with physical activity, but no main effect of personalized diet, indicating that the personalized diet didn't impact on appetite. Our secondary joint, or our other joint primary outcome, as I mentioned, was energy intake at the ad libitum test meal. And again, we saw this significant increase with physical activity, where we saw an increase in both the physical activity and the combined group compared to the control group. And again, we saw no main effect of the personalized diet, indicating that the personalized diet alone didn't alter energy intake at the test meal. As I said earlier, we were also interested in habitual diet assessed via the 3-day food diary. So this figure here shows the change in daily energy intake during that 3-day period in week 12 of the intervention. So again, you can see here we saw a main effect of physical activity, and this was particularly apparent in the personalized diet plus physical activity group, indicating that that personalized diet, in addition to physical activity, supported an increase in daily energy intake in that group. And again, we saw no main effect of personalized diet, however, on its own. Looking at in terms of protein intake, the changes are shown here. So the personalized diet was effective in significantly increasing daily protein intake as assessed from the 3-day food diary. And you can see an increase of about 0.2 grams per kilo per day in the personalized diet alone group and of 0.4 grams per kilo body weight per day in the combined group. As part of the rationale was that we were focused on trying to increase protein diversity in the diet and increase the intake of plant protein. Some preliminary analyses undertaken by an MSc student at UCD, Chloe Fitzgerald, has been focused on breaking down where that protein intake, what sources it's coming from. So this table here shows the change in protein intake coming from both animal and plant protein sources from pre to post intervention in both the diet alone group and then the combined diet plus physical activity group. And if you look down here at the bottom, this is the change in plant protein intake. So you can see a significant increase from pre-intervention to week 12 in plant protein intake in the diet alone group, and also a highly significant increase in the combined diet plus physical activity group, whereas there was very little change in animal protein intake. Another aspect of the diet that we were interested in was fibre, and this figure here shows the change in fibre intake. So overall, there was a significant increase, and this was particularly in the personalised diet plus physical activity group, where it increased by 8 grams per day. There was a trend towards a significant increase in the personalised diet alone group, but it was smaller than that observed within the combined group. We were interested in habitual appetite, as I mentioned as well, which we assessed through the simplified nutritional appetite questionnaire. However, we saw no changes across the 4 groups. These were small changes, they were less than 1 and not significant. And one reason for this could be just the sensitivity of the simplified nutritional appetite questionnaire for detecting change, given the limited ordinal responses in the questionnaire. Finally, as I mentioned, we were interested in appetite-related peptides as a potential mechanism that could explain some of the changes in appetite that we observed. These figures here show the changes in postprandial leptin from post-breakfast right up until 3 hours later, just before the lunch meal. And these are the changes across the 4 groups from pre to post-intervention. So pre-intervention is shown in blue and post-intervention is shown in red. And where we saw an interesting effect here is in the physical activity alone group, where post-intervention, you can see that red line is lower. So the postprandial leptin levels were lower post-intervention in physical activity and with physical activity. And this is interesting because previously some research has shown higher postprandial leptin levels to be associated with greater or with poor appetite in older adults. In terms of the other hormones, we saw no significant differences in ghrelin, in GLP-1, or in PYY. So in summary, in terms of the key findings, the personalized diet incorporating the plant protein fiber products had no significant effect on appetite or energy intake, meaning that it didn't compromise appetite or energy intake. However, the personalized diet effectively increased daily protein intake in both groups and fiber, particularly in the combined personalized diet plus physical activity group. The personalized diet also effectively increased protein coming from plant sources in the diet. And an important finding is that physical activity had a positive effect on both appetite and energy intake. This could be explained in part by a reduction in fat mass and potentially a corresponding reduction in or in postprandial leptin with physical activity. In terms of practical implications of these findings, they suggest that alongside personalized dietary advice, plant protein and fiber can be supplemented to increase protein and fiber intake without compromising appetite and overall daily energy intake. They also suggest that plant protein and fiber supplements can be used to increase diversity of protein sources within the diet. And finally, they provide indication that physical activity should be considered as part of strategies to enhance appetite and energy intake in older adults. In terms of future directions, further research is needed to explore the underlying mechanisms contributing to the changes observed with the combined physical activity and diet group. This could be social factors associated with physical activity. We've also previously shown greater liking and wanting towards food, faster gastric emptying, and improved taste perception in younger active compared to inactive people. So these factors, among others, could have a role and warrant further investigation in older adults. The efficacy of different types and forms of plant proteins, such as oral nutritional supplements versus protein fortified foods, warrant further investigation. As Anna mentioned, the sensory acceptance and longer term adherence needs further study. This was focused on a 12-week intervention, so the findings are limited to that duration. And also important to highlight that there's few studies in older adults with undernutrition, so further evidence is needed when considering more vulnerable populations of older adults with lower daily protein intakes. In terms of current and further analyses, as has been mentioned previously, a lot of data was collected as part of the project. So some ongoing analyses, as Dominique mentioned, include characterizing the impact of the plant protein fiber products on muscle protein synthesis. We're also investigating some other health-related biomarkers and outcomes that we collected as part of the trial. And ongoing analyses are focusing on the gut microbiome and plasma metabolomics as well. So it was a big project conducted over the last few years. So I'd just like to finish by thanking everyone who contributed to the trial across the 4 countries. There were many people involved in it, to the participants as well, and also finally to say thank you for your attention.
Super. Thank you so much, Katy. So now I will invite Claire, Anna, and also Katy to perhaps answer some of the questions which are in the chat box. So firstly, Anna, Anne-Marie Beck is very interested. She said that sorry, I missed whether the data about the adverse events were also collected amongst the control group. For example, it is probably not uncommon to have GI symptoms. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, that's a great point, Anne-Marie. We didn't collect any adverse events data on the control group, so we tested them pre and post, and we had no contact with them in the middle. We do think that the GI symptoms are in relation to the increased fibre intake, and we can see that drop off as the intervention goes on for the majority of participants, again, as they get used to that increased fibre. And participants did note that themselves. There was some comments there included on the slides, but participants did mention that they did notice the difference of increasing the fibre. They did notice changes, perhaps in stool frequency. They did attribute that to the added fibre, and they did think that was a benefit in the majority of cases. But yeah, to answer your question, no, we didn't collect that data on the control group.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Anna. And the second question I have here is from Kim Jin, and she is wondering whether older adults might increase their sugar intake to help tolerate the taste of the PPFs, such as, say, incorporating it into juices, and has this been observed in any cases? I guess, Anna, maybe this goes back to your presentation as well.
Yeah, again, that's a brilliant question. Kim, we haven't looked at that yet. We do have a lot of dietary data from the food diaries that we've yet to analyze fully. I think that was a surprise. I don't think we expected the participants to consume it in juices as much and as in liquids as much. So that's definitely something that we want to look into. So yeah, thank you for raising that.
And our third question is coming from Tina Monk. And essentially, Tina wants to know more about the control group. And I think I'll revert this to Katy, because again, the control group is probably the most important group in a dietary intervention or a physical activity intervention in this space.
Yeah. So we did give a lot of thought initially when designing the study as to what the control group might entail and whether they'd be given some sort of advice or a typical kind of um, what might be typically advised to an older adult with poor appetite. In the end, we decided that we'd go with that they would receive no contact and no, basically no, just testing pre and post that 12-week period, as this was probably reflective of what would be the case for most older adults. I don't know, Claire, if you want to add anything further to that.
I don't know if Tina's point is, were they different in any way, but the randomization was anybody who came, and I probably should have mentioned that. So they were randomized 1-1-1-1 into each group. So there's no, and then when the baseline characteristics were examined, there was no difference between the baseline characteristics of those in each group. So the control group, in theory anyway, should be no different than any of the other three groups.
Okay,